Awesome. Welcome, everybody. I'm just going to give some quick updates on what's been going on at SPIFFE since the last community day, and then I'll pass it off to Augustine to give a similar kind of spiel about SPIRE. So the first thing that comes to mind, obviously, is there's been for me, obviously at least, is there's been a bunch of movement in SPIFFE support in the cloud service providers lately. So just in the last 2 months, GCP has announced that they're aligning on SPIFFE's workload identity framework. And Microsoft has also come out, I think just like a month after that, and said that they're also aligning on the SPIFFE framework. So I have a lot of hope for the future on this. I think SPIFFE compatibility for SPIFFE auth against these services is going to improve a whole lot with this news. I know that at least Google has already started work on this, and so there should be some exciting stuff to come in the next 6 months or so on that front. We've also had a couple big integrations get released in other projects since the last community day. I think Trafic was the first one to come out. And both of these were kind of a while in the making and then officially released since last community day, as I mentioned. So Trafic is just like an API gateway load balancer. Now supports SPIFFE workload API natively, so you can do SPIFFE auth to all your backend services. And Cilium is eBPF based machine-to-machine service. I wouldn't quite call it a service mesh, but it's similar to that, and it's grown a SPIFFE SPIRE integration to pull SFIDs and do MTLS based auth from workload to workload using SFIDs coming from SPIRE. So I mentioned that was quite a bit of work. We actually worked with the Cilium team a couple years ago to put in new APIs on SPIRE agent to power this integration. So we're super pleased to see it launched. SIG-SPEC, which is the group that presides over the maintenance of the SPIFFE specifications themselves, has been more or less dormant for the last year. And I kind of mentioned this last year as well. I think it's a relatively positive sign that the specs are pretty mature and they've been working fairly well. Though we have had some recent movement in the last 6 months, maybe 4 or 6 months or so. One of those is around JOT SFID improvements. When we define JOT, I think there was always a desire to do a little bit better than what the JOT specs provided. And so, the JOT SFID profile requires a bunch of things that JOT doesn't necessarily require. But the nature of it being a bearer token still kind of leaves some things to be desired. And so recently, new RFC came out called DPOP, a demonstrated proof of possession, and OAuth, and that defined what they call a DPOP proof that gets sent along with your access token. And what this does is it's got a signature over it, and it binds a public key to the token, and then it signs over properties of that request. And being able to do this is something that, we kind of talked about, dreamed about for a long time in SPIFFE circles. And so it was really nice to see this thing come out and get ratified. And so we've been taking a look at it and trying to figure out how we can apply it to JOT SFID. The good news is that there are some really great patterns there, and I think kind of the worst news is that it's hard to make it directly applicable for a few reasons. The first one is that the DPOP proof puts the public key that signs over the proof in the proof itself. And I think the natural thing for SPIFFE would be to put it inside the JOT, similar to the way an X509 cert has the public key in the cert, right? They do this because OAuth doesn't actually define the token format, so there's actually like a reference to the token hash, and that's what does the key binding. But I think we have an opportunity to do something a little bit nicer there. And then the second part, which I quite like actually, is this is the piece that binds it to the request. So, for HTTP, this is like the method for the HTTP request and the URL for that HTTP request. Included in that proof, so you can't just take this proof off of one request and put it onto another request. And that's a super nice property, but the problem is that the spec only defines HTTP as protocol, and we need to support a bunch of other things. And so I think we've got a little bit of work to do to figure out how to unlock those use cases. But the good news is that we have like a really great pattern here to start from, and we can kind of see a path forward there. We also have been talking a little bit about this idea of like a bundle of bundles. SPIFFE defines a bundle and a trust domain, and a bundle represents, the authorities that are valid in that trust domain. But we have problems where, hey, you're trying to kind of ship these bundles around in aggregate, right? We also have challenges where you may be trying to deliver an aggregation of bundles to a workload over something other than the workload API. And so in these kinds of cases, it's desirable to have some kind of notion of, okay, what actually is the structure that we use to aggregate all of these things? There's a really important property here where the trust domain name needs to be strongly bound to the bundle that it represents, and you can't really mission match these things up. The spec talks a lot about this today, but we don't actually have a data structure that puts that tuple in place, right? So this bundle of bundles would be something that can do that. So I mentioned the workload API. Workload API transmits a map of these bundles in that same way, but that's really the only place we do it now. And so this work is all about trying to take a step back and define the container or format to serialize this kind of bundle of bundles and the map trust domains to the bundle material. There's a GitHub issue here if you want to follow along on that. And then the last update I have is on transitive identity. I know talked a little bit about it in the last community day, and we actually had a presentation about how some of the tech we were doing there and token extension and wrapping and all this kind of stuff. We've been making some really good progress, kind of slowly moving up the stack. All the conversations are kind of moved away from what's the crypto that we need to use and how do we aggregate these signatures and how do these things behave. And now we're talking more about like, okay, how do you represent a root token? How does this thing propagate through a SPIFFE system? Exactly how would it be implemented in SPIRL, come through an agent, all that kind of stuff. So we're making pretty good progress there. I think it's pretty promising. And the folks who've been working on that work are actually going to go be presenting it at the next IETF conference in Prague, which is in November. There is a new group in IETF that is exploring some of this workload identity space. And so they've also been looking into SPIFFE, and we'll actually have a talk a little bit later today about some of that stuff. So that was all I have for you on SPIFFE updates. I wanted to pause for questions if there are any before I pass it off to Augustine. I don't know if somebody's watching the Slack or the Zoom chat.
Yeah, Zoom chat as well.